We've seen this with COVID-19 and its restrictions, and we've seen that it can amplify much more serious mental health problems. In addition, when people experience stress in their outside world, then they can detach themselves from that world. But when we've been doing that for a long time, some people will find it difficult to reattach. And what happens here is then that people actually push themselves into further social isolation, and into further loneliness. And then we know that this impacts on people's mental health. So psychologists around the world are really increasingly raising these concerns that these impacts will last longer than the pandemic itself. But this really isn't actually a surprise for us, because we see this time and time again in response to other epidemics and other large-scale disasters. I think it's important to acknowledge, first of all, that the way in which COVID-19 and lockdown has impacted on people's mental health, of course, has a huge degree of variability. Some people will have remained largely unaffected and they'll continue as close to normal as possible, whereas other people will have experienced kind of associated adversities and then felt the initial impact of this on their kind of psychological well-being and mental health, but then they might just bounce back from it, and they might bounce back pretty quickly. So we call this resilience. And thankfully, most people in the population do fall into this resilient group. So when they experience adversity, they have this ability to bounce back. And there was actually a report published by the Mental Health Foundation back in April, and they collected data back in April in 2020. And they found that about 3/4, so about 75% of people reported that they were actually coping really well with the COVID-19 situation and the associated lockdown. But unfortunately, they did report that there was a decline in people's ability to cope as time moved on. And when they got to the point of collecting data in August 2020, they were reporting that only about 65% of people, 67% of people were reporting that they were coping well. And then they also looked at different subgroups of individuals, and they found, when they looked at the younger groups, so those between the ages of 18 to 24, that the degree of decline in how well people were coping was much steeper. And come August, only about 56% of people said that they were coping well with the situation. But I think, taking all that into consideration, there's a kind of take-home message. And the take-home message is that most people, so more people than not, are actually doing quite well. But for some, the situation will indeed have impacted on their mental health to varying degrees. So it's really important that when we think about this, that we think about it as kind of not one size fits all, because it's definitely not an equal situation for people.